This is Bill Sydnor, author of the Mitchell's Magical Day series. You might be familiar with these books. They're in each of the elementary schools in Broward County Public Schools. I would like to introduce you to a couple of them. This is Mitchell's Magical Day on South Florida's Atlantic coast, and the main content of this book is about shipwrecks and pirates and slave ships and things that happened off the coast here of southeastern Florida. Here we have Mitchell's Magical Day on the New River. This book features, of course, our historic New River, the forts that stood there, and the commerce and things that happened during that time from about going quite a ways back to the Tequesta Indians up into our modern history. Here we have Mitchell's Magical Day with Frank and Ivy Stranahan. This is the first book that I had published, and of course will always be one of my favorites because I knew Ivy Stranahan when I was a young man. I used to be able to sit with her. Her house had been turned into a restaurant, the lower floor. She lived upstairs, and sometimes I would sit with her, and she would tell me stories of the Seminoles paddling down to trade at her husband's trading post, and she was the very first school teacher. Her name was Ivy Cromartie. She married Frank Stranahan, and they are some of our city's founders. I've also written a book about the Bonnet House, Mitchell's Magical Day at Historic Bonnet House. And this is a cover of featuring the Bonnet House Boathouse. This book, however, contains all four of these books into one anthology. So it has lots and lots of stories inside. My most recent book is Mitchell's Magical Day, Exploring Fort Lauderdale's History Through Pop-Up's Old Binoculars. This book is chock full of wonderful old photographs and postcards. And as you can see, they kind of tell the history of our city from its earliest development all the way up into about the 1950s. For those of you who remember Red Ribbon Week that we celebrate in October or recognize in October, this is Mitchell's very special Red Ribbon Day. And this talks about how to resist drugs and make better decisions surrounding some of the things that people try to pressure us into doing. This is a book that is nonfiction. This is Mitchell's small boat book, and this is a book about boating safety for younger people. It tells you how to tie knots and to be safe out on the water. And so this is a book that really talks about how to stay safe on our waterways. Today, I'm not going to read any of these books. They're all available to you on YouTube or on Facebook. But today I'm going to talk about writing itself. Now, you probably know from my books that they feature Pop-Up's magical binoculars. One of the things I think every writer needs is to have inspiration. And when I wanted to tell the story for my first book of the Stranahans, particularly Ivy Stranahan, who I so admired, I thought, how can I tell this story in a way that is unique and can capture the reader's attention? And you're the readers. I was a fourth grade teacher, and I remember some of the history books about Florida were kind of boring. And when I was in fourth grade, I went to Harbordale Elementary, and I didn't think the books were very interesting back then either. So I was determined to come up with a way to tell the story through a unique means, and I needed some inspiration. I had Ivy Stranahan as my inspiration, of course, and I also had these. These are my grandfather's binoculars. He gave them to me when I was very young. He would take me fishing with him, and I would wander off and get into trouble. So he would say to me, use these, look through them carefully, and if you look very carefully, you'll see things that no one else can see. So when he was on the fishing pier, I'd be staring off in the distance using his binoculars, and I would use the second tool that we need is imagination. As a young boy, I'd use these in my imagination, and I would think I saw pirates and shipwrecks and who knows what else. So these were part of the inspiration, as was Ivy Stranahan. There was one more inspiration that not too many people know about, and that is Mitchell. All of my books feature the name Mitchell. Mitchell is on all of the covers, but who was Mitchell? Well, Mitchell was a young man that I taught my very first year of teaching many, many years ago. And Mitchell had a mental handicap, meaning that he was not able to process information the way other people could. Mitchell was in ninth grade, but he could only read on a primer or first grade level. So we would take him to the elementary school from the middle school, and he would get books such as Dr. Seuss books. And I'm sure you're all familiar with those books, some of my favorites. Well, Mitchell would read the Dr. Seuss books, and then he would take shoe boxes and he would make little theaters out of them and little puppets, and he would retell the story. And we would take him to the elementary school with his shoebox stages and his puppets, and he would do storytelling for the kindergarten class. And they didn't know Mitchell had any learning problems at all. All they saw was a great storyteller with a wonderful imagination. Do you remember the Dr. Seuss book, Are You My Mother? Well, Mitchell told that whole story, but at the end, he added his own twist. Where is my father? Are you my father? And he and the mother bird would go around looking for the father bird. So Mitchell didn't know his father, and so that was a part of something that came from his own mind, his own imagination. So I had three sources of inspiration. I had Ivy Stranahan, Pop-Pop's binoculars, and my student Mitchell, who became the protagonist or the main character of all of my books. When my books came out, I contacted Mitch's mother to let her know that Mitch was going to be featured in these books, and she was very happy. The other thing we have to have besides inspiration and imagination, especially if you're going to write fiction, you need a good imagination. But there's one other piece that is very difficult sometimes, and that's motivation. Motivation means that you're going to put forth the work to get your story out. It's one thing to just tell a story. It's another to put it on paper and make sure that it is exactly the way you want. I bet a lot of you like to draw or do artwork more than you like to write. And that was me too. When I was in school, if I didn't know the answer to a question on a test, I would just draw a picture. The picture may not have anything to do with the question. I just felt like drawing. I got into a little trouble for that. But I always liked to draw. And I began to understand that writing is an art form like drawing. You draw a rough draft, but if you want to really get your best work out there, you have to study your work and do drafts and then make it your final piece. So artwork, visual artwork, drawing, painting, and so forth is very much like writing, as is dance, as is theater, as is sports. You don't go out and just play because you think you can. You always want to get a little better. You want to get a little better and more refined in your work and make it the best it can be. And so that takes motivation. Some people don't have a lot of motivation for writing. That's okay. I don't have a lot of motivation for sports, so we're all a little different. Well, let's get back to Mitchell's books. We have Mitchell, we have Pop-Pop's binoculars, and we have Ivy's stories. So the first thing I had to do was to begin in my mind to figure out how I'm going to put all this together. And I thought if Pop-Pop's binoculars can take Mitchell back into the past, where he can see Ivy Stranahan and communicate with her, then the book might be a little more interesting. So rather than just being nonfiction, which would just be facts and dates and so forth, I decided to make it historical fiction. Historical fiction is where we blend history with some made-up things. So obviously, Mitchell is a character, even though he's based on a real person. He's a character. And the binoculars don't really take Mitchell into the past. That is fiction. Some of the characters in the book are fiction. But then again, some of them were real. So we have a blend of history and fiction, and that's historical fiction. Once I had made up my mind to do that, I was pretty happy with that idea, I had to really do some research because the fiction part was a little easier. I could use my imagination for the fiction part. But what about the history? If you're really going to tell history, you better do it right. And I knew my books were going to be going into our school system, and I didn't want there to be any details that were not accurate in the history side. So I had to really do a lot of research. And I just want to show you a page. I have page after page after page after page after page after page after page of research that I have done for my books. What I generally do is use a variety of sources to try to find out something about what I'm going to be telling. Now, I knew Ivy Stranahan a bit, but I didn't know everything about her. I didn't know everything about the Stranahan house. I didn't know everything about the history of Fort Lauderdale. I had to learn. And to learn, you really have to do research. So I went to the Historical Society. I sat with books and journals and notes and volumes of things and took notes, copious notes, and so that I would be able to then later refer. So this is just an example. I have many pages like that. Once I got my notes in order, for the first book. Let's just focus on that one right now. Mitchell's Magical Day. Let me search for it with Frank and Ivy Stranahan. Once I had my notes and the things that I wanted to do, I began to talk to people who were historians, people who may have known a little more than I did about where I was headed with my story, and to make sure that I had it right. And actually, in this book, I had written the rough draft, and there was a major mistake in it. In this story, the hurricane of 1926 approaches Fort Lauderdale, and in my original draft, I had Frank and Ivy inside the Stranahan house, trapped by the hurricane. But I found out, in doing more research, that Frank and Ivy were not even in Fort Lauderdale when that hurricane hit. They had traveled to Ohio to visit Frank's relatives, and the house was empty. I couldn't very well tell a story about Frank and Ivy being in the hurricane in 1926 when they weren't even here. I had to go back and rewrite that entire section of the book because I had made an assumption that, of course, they're going to be here. They lived in the house, but it just so happened that at that time they were not home, and I had to go back and rewrite that part of the story. So research is very important, and talking to people who know or people who can guide you to information is very important, especially if you are writing anything to do with facts. If you are just writing fiction, straight fiction, then maybe you wouldn't need to do that. We talked a little bit about drawing and artwork, and I've always liked to draw. This is just a little pen and ink I did of some swans for Bonnet House. I don't know if you can see those. Very simple line drawings. And I decided this is the type of illustration I'm going to have in my book. Just very simple line drawings, not very complex artwork, because I was going to use old photographs to tell the story. So I didn't really need a lot of fancy artwork. Also, my books were being printed in black and white because of costs. It's expensive to print in color, and the publisher only gave me the ability to print in black and white. So I had to figure out what kind of drawings I was going to put in my book. And most importantly, what was Mitchell going to look like? I had to think about that. So I sat with a pen and just some plain old copy paper and started drawing pictures of Mitch. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of faces. Some of them are pretty goofy, aren't they? You can see I've got a theme going here, but I'm not quite ready yet. I've practiced and practiced all these different kinds of faces, and it does take a lot of practice when you have an idea in your head. And I knew Mitchell was going to be holding the binoculars, so I began sketching him out with the binoculars. But you can see in this picture, he looks like he's about 4 years old. Well, Mitchell was supposed to be in fourth grade, not 4 years old. So you can see I really had to make some changes to these pictures and how Mitch was going to look. Some of these came out a little better than others. You can see I've also got some pictures on the side of maybe what the school teacher was going to look like and maybe what his friends were going to look like. And some of these drawings are absolutely terrible. I know that. But that's what we do when we are practicing. This one is in pencil, so I'm going to hold it up. You can begin to see some of these characters' drawings. You might recognize some of them. Here's some more. Some of these are really ridiculous, so you can laugh if you want. Look at this one. This little boy with his skinny little head. I don't know what I was thinking. Mitchell and the binoculars, but that doesn't look so good, does it? I'm going to skip some of these because I want to share some of the more important ones with you. I'm hoping you'll be able to see this. I hope it transfers. Let's see. Do you see Pop-Up? There's a very early sketch of Pop-Up. Pop-Up plays a big role in this book. And of course, he's the one who has the binoculars. And I used my natural grandfather, my Pop-Up, as the character in the book, even though by the time my book came out, my Pop-Up had passed away, but I still wanted to use him as part of the book. Here I begin to narrow down what Mitchell might look like. I have a check mark next to that one, but I don't use that one. You can see different kinds of looks for Mitch, and I'm beginning to clarify what he might look like. The trouble is I had to ensure that Mitchell consistently looked the same and that Mitchell looked like a fourth or fifth grader, that he didn't look like a little kid. And sometimes I was more fortunate than other times. Here's one of those times that didn't work out so well. You can see the Stranahan house in the background. I'm beginning to get an idea of how Mitch is going to look. So finally, I decided I kind of had practiced enough and I knew what Mitchell was going to look like. And then I began some line drawings for my book. Here's the school bus they ride, pen and ink. This is just very simple pen, black pen on copy paper. Nothing fancy about it. Dugout canoe. You can do this. I sketch it first in pencil, then I go over it with the black pen, because if I made a mistake in pencil, I can erase it. Can't really do that with pen, but I'm going to tell you what you can do to fix pen in just a minute. Here's a drawing from, I think, the pirate book or maybe the boating book. So you can see, very simple pen and ink. For those of you who read the Mid-Atlantic book, you'll recognize these. Those are the shackles that the slaves wore aboard the slave ship Henrietta Marie. If you haven't read that book yet, or you haven't watched my video of that book, I hope you will. It's actually my favorite. Well, then we get down to it. What will the real illustrations look like for the book? I've already got my story. I've kind of laid it out. I have an idea of what I want to present in an illustration as opposed to an old photograph. I don't really have a photograph of Pop-Up and Mitchell, of course, because they are fiction. So I had to come up with my own idea of what Pop-Up and Mitchell look like. And here we see Pop-Up, and of course those very special binoculars, and there's Mitchell. And that is somewhat what my Pop-Up looked like, and perhaps Mitchell looks a little bit like I looked like at that time. And some more pen and ink, very basic pictures. Mitchell's best friend Billy, and Mitchell at a pond at Bonnet House. This is one of my favorites, just for basic pen and ink drawing, line drawings. Mitchell standing on the shore, looking off in the distance. This is a lovely picture too, Pop-Up and Mitchell on the water taxi. I'm going to try to move in here and see, do you see any corrections? It's very hard to show that through this camera, but right in here, there are some corrections on Pop-Up's arm where I made a mistake with the ink, with the pen, and I didn't want to start the whole drawing over again, so I used whiteout, correction fluid. This is the same thing. You can't really see it here, but there is some correction fluid on that drawing where I made a mistake with the pen. I didn't want to start the whole drawing over again, so I used a little whiteout, and that's just fine. Have you ever seen Snoopy cartoons or comic strips? Charlie Brown and Snoopy? My favorite. I went to see an exhibit of Charles Schulz, the artist, to see his drawings, and I actually saw in some of the original drawings where he had used whiteout to cover up some of his mistakes. He didn't want to throw the whole drawing away, and once I realized that the man who drew Snoopy could do that, I figured I could do it too. And some more just very basic drawings. Again, started in pencil and then gone over with ink. So I think we get an idea of the drawings, and I had to decide in my story what drawings I wanted and where they would go in the story. Then I began really laying out the story. I wrote it in hand first. I wrote it on paper. My first book, I wrote all on paper, and then I typed it into a computer. My later books, or the books I work on now, I do all on computer. I don't do any writing by hand, but I used to. After I submitted my writing with the drawings to the graphic designer, the person who was going to lay out my book, she produced what we call little galley sheets, little examples of what the book might look like when it's published. Just a piece of paper with the pages, how they might look. And as you can see, there are some corrections here. One of the hardest things about being a writer, remember, is the motivation. It's not just the motivation to tell the story, it's the motivation to tell the story right. And that means you have to be very careful with your grammar and your punctuation. You have to be very careful with your spelling and your sentence structure. So here's a picture from the Bonnet House book. And you can see all the corrections. I pretty much know, but I wasn't. I still had much work to do. After I fixed what needed to be fixed and got the book into what we might call the final draft form, then the publisher or the graphic designer sent me a little note on the back of this paper, and it says this is the mini layout of the first few pages, and we would have a look. Now, this is called a galley proof. If you're a writer, you get what's called a galley proof, and they just staple some pages together to show you what your book is going to look like. And in that case, then what you have to do is go through very, very, very carefully, because this is your last chance. Once you review this book and you say it's okay, it goes to the printer and you're kind of done. So you better have done a good job. So what I do is I ask teachers and students and friends to read my galley proofs and to go through them very carefully to see if there are any mistakes. And if there are mistakes, we still have time to fix it before it goes off to the printer. So I've got lots of galley proofs from my books, and I rather enjoy keeping them because it reminds me of all the work that went into what I was doing. What do you think one of the most fun parts of writing is when you're designing your own book? It's the cover. I really enjoy creating my covers and working with a graphic designer to create my covers. I'm just going to show you this. This is a draft of the very first cover of the very first book, Mitchell's Magical Day with Frank and Ivy Stranahan. And I've made some notes here and there. I don't know if you can see them. I wasn't very pleased with this cover. I didn't like the color. There were certain things I didn't really like about it. So I contacted the graphic designer and we worked on it until we got it a little bit better into something that I really liked. Now you can see in here, here's the binoculars, of course, and then you can see in here there's a painting. Each of my books has a painting that I did. This happens to be a watercolor of the Stranahan house that I had done. And hold on just a second, I'll show you some others. On the Florida Atlantic Coast book, this is a picture of a ship that I painted to fit inside the binoculars to help tell the story. And here we have another painting of the New River and the Stranahan house in the background. So I like to include my own artwork, not just the line drawings. I like to include my own artwork in each of my books. And then you're finished. Now, what I've learned in the meantime is I've learned how to design my own books, how to do my own graphic art, and how to design my own covers. There's a process that makes it very easy. There are a lot of software programs now that weren't available when I first started writing. So now I'm able to create my own books the way I like them to be. It's a lot of work. You still need someone to proofread very carefully, but I don't really have to go through a publisher anymore. I can self-publish, and I do that through a software program that allows me to print my own books the way I like them, and it's much less expensive. So you could probably print your own books too when you finally get to that point that you feel you're ready. So this last book, I just want to share with you the most recent book I did, which is the postcard book. I did all by myself. I designed the cover. I laid it all out myself. I did all the graphic design myself. I entered the words. I did all the pictures. I didn't take the pictures, but I inserted the pictures exactly the way I wanted them so that the book would be the way I wanted. And that way, if there were any mistakes or if there was something in the layout that I didn't like, I could go back and change it on my computer rather than having to call a publisher and say, look, can we change this picture? Can we move this picture? I can do it myself. And you can learn this too. Believe me, if I could learn it, you can learn it too. And the software program I use makes it very simple. So I hope maybe one day you will be interested in publishing your own books. Maybe you could do it as a class project when school starts again. Maybe you could do it as a family project. Maybe you'd like to interview somebody in your family who maybe has a story to tell, and you could save that story by doing a very special book. So remember our three primary things that an author needs. You have to have inspiration, and again, I happen to have these wonderful binoculars that my pop-up gave me when I was a very young man. I had the opportunity to sit with Ivy Stranahan and listen to her stories of the New River settlement and how it was when she first got here to teach school in the one-room schoolhouse where she had 9 students. The city's changed a great deal since then. Ivy passed away when I was 13 years old. And of course, I had Mitchell, the protagonist, the character that I so admired when I was a teacher. Even though he had a lot of challenges, he allowed his imagination and his strength and his spirit to become very creative. And so I always admired that in him. Those were my inspirations. I used 3 primary inspirations. And then I had to have some creativity, some imagination. Now, this is what you need if you're going to write fiction or even nonfiction, because you have to write it in a way that is interesting to the reader. You just don't want a bunch of facts. Anybody can throw facts out there. That's not really writing. That's more like reporting. If you're going to write fiction or nonfiction, You need to do it in a way that will be interesting to your reader and also convey the information you want to share. And then the third thing is, we might say motivation. Some people say perspiration. Work, 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 work. It's not easy. If you want it to be good and you want it to be right, it takes time. It takes me about a year from the time I start a book to I finish it, till it comes out. And during that year, I have to do research and I have to get my thoughts together. I have to do drafts. I have to do drawings. I have to think very carefully. I have to interview people to make sure that I'm getting this story straight. And then I have to go back and edit and fix and make sure it's the way I want. Are my books perfect when I'm finished? No. No, I'm going to tell you right now that in my first book, there were 8,000 copies printed in the year 2000. This book is now 20 years old, and I'm still very happy with it. But there were mistakes in it. And one of the mistakes is in a word that we don't use in English language. It's a Creek word. Creek Indians or Seminole language, Watcha-Istahutri, which basically means a non-Native American woman who looks after the children. They used to call Ivy Stranahan Watcha-Istahutri because she would look after the Seminole children when they would come to the trading post, and she would try to teach them to read and so forth. In my book, I have the Seminole children calling out to Ivy, Watcha-Istahutri. But in the very next sentence, I didn't catch the misspelling, neither did the editor or anyone else, and it says Watcha-Istahurti, Hurtie, Watcha-Istahurti. I didn't even know about it until I went out to a school to talk to a group of students, and one of them said, "What does Watcha-Istahurti mean?" I said, "No, it's Watcha-Istahutri." They said, "Not in your book, it's Watcha-Istahurti." So even though we had done lots of reviews, there's still some mistakes, and that's the way it goes sometimes. We do the very best we can. I hope that you enjoyed this time we were able to share together. I hope you'll watch some of the videos of my books, and when you get back to school, you'll be able to go to your media center and find these books in your library. People ask me all the time if they can buy their own copies of my books, which you can on Amazon. All of the money that I receive for those books I use to buy more books to put into schools. So I donate all that money back into schools. And I hope that you will have the opportunity, whether when you get back to school, you can go to your media specialist and you can find these books in your school. If you have any questions for me, you can always go to my website. It's mitchellsmagicaldays.com. Mitchell's with no apostrophe, magicaldays.com. And there's a space there where you can write to me and you can ask questions, and you can also learn more about my books there. Well, it was good to talk to you today. Take good care, and I'll see you again soon. Ciao.